Super Smash Bros. Speculation is a lot like junk food. Overabundant, self-indulgent, and probably getting in the way of something more unique and productive. But it's quick, easy, and sometimes it hits just the right spot. And my friends, I just may be a hypocrite because I have been watching a boatload of Smash 6 roster speculation videos recently. With the Switch 2 out and Kirby Air Riders on the way, a new Smash Bros. Game is sure to follow. This seems like the perfect time to do a video about this before getting truly caught up in the zeitgeist. Thus, I present to you not one, not two, but 6 hypothetical Smash 6 rosters of increasing absurdity. The premise will make more sense as the video goes on, so without further ado, let's get into the rosters. This first roster will be my honest attempt at predicting the next Smash lineup. This isn't what I want, although I'm sure my biases have inadvertently crept in there. This is what I think Sakurai would do, which leads us nicely into our ground rules. First off, Sakurai will be directing this game. Even if Sakurai wants to step down from Smash Bros., which he probably does at this point to be honest, Nintendo won't let him and are probably going to do whatever they can to get him to do another game. The idea that Smash can't go anywhere from Ultimate and that they need to start with a clean slate, or alternatively just keep porting Ultimate until the end of time, is a nice thought, but thinking about it from Nintendo's perspective as a company, the most logical decision for Smash 6 is probably just to continue with the series in the same way that Smash 4 did after Brawl and Brawl did after Melee. As such, we are shooting for a roster bigger than 4's base roster, but smaller than Ultimate's. I'm going with 65 total fighters as a nice clean number. Additionally, because we're treating Ultimate as the exception rather than the rule, adding new fighters is going to take the priority over retaining as many veteran fighters as possible. I've selected 16 new fighters for this exercise. Before we talk about who's getting added though, I first want to talk about who's getting cut. One popular type of roster speculation video is cutting half of Ultimate's roster. I've seen a number of comments online claiming that, while a fun video idea, cutting half of Ultimate's characters isn't something that would actually happen, but I would disagree. If we want to end up with around 65 fighters, 16 of which are new characters, we actually do have to cut 40 characters, or a little less than half of Ultimate's roster. As such, within this first hypothetical roster, you're getting a little bonus cutting half the roster video. Starting off, there are a couple of really obvious cuts we can make. Any character that has been cut before is automatically out. If they were expendable before, they can be expendable again. Sorry Lucas, I hate to bring the Mother series back down to one character, but that's just how it goes. I am, however, making exceptions for Pokemon Trainer and Ice Climbers, because Sakurai specifically said they were only cut due to technical limitations and that he initially wanted to keep them in for Smash 4. Next off, all the Square Enix characters are out. I've seen some roster cut videos that choose not to consider licensing issues as a factor in favor of attempting to create a balanced roster. But the fact of the matter is that licensing is an issue, and Sakurai has consistently cited Square's characters as being hard to get, either for the music or for the character themselves. And yes, I'm including Sora as Square Enix here, even though technically he's owned by Disney, as there were clearly still some licensing issues there. I'm also cutting the Belmonts because of the wishy-washiness with Snake, and Terry because he's now owned by the government of Saudi Arabia. Finally, all the Echo Fighters are getting cut, except for Daisy and Chrom. The former because she is a core part of the Mario cast now, and the latter because Sakurai wanted to include him all the way back in Smash 4. Echo Fighters were a good idea on paper, but they were so underutilized that I don't see why Sakurai ever bothered to categorize them. If it were up to me, the Echo Fighter lineup in Ultimate would have looked like this, but we're going to proceed forth with the idea that they will largely continue to be neglected as a concept and as such are not a consideration I'm making for this roster. That's all the really easy cuts out of the way, but we still don't have to start being too choosy yet, because there are a few cuts that are more obvious than the others. Duck Hunt and Piranha Plant are both joke characters, so they're out. Wii Fit Trainer is also largely a joke character and is also out, although I'm mentioning her separately because her status as a representative of Nintendo's casual games is something worth keeping in mind. Corrin was only included in Smash 4 as a marketing push, so they're out. Though I suspect the same was also true of Byleth, people actually like Three Houses, so there's more of an incentive to keep Byleth in. Palutena was also arguably included as promotion for Uprising and isn't really relevant anymore on account of Uprising not having received a follow-up since. Initially, I was opposed to cutting Palutena since Uprising was a Sakurai project, but relevancy is a major factor in determining who to cut, and in any case, we're still keeping Pit. Little Mac and Rob are also being cut for relevancy reasons. Little Mac was more relevant at the time of Smash 4's release, but we haven't gotten a new Punch-Out since the Wii, and Ice Climbers is still on the roster to represent the classic NES era. I was a little more hesitant about cutting Rob, since he uniquely represents a peripheral that was crucial to the NES's marketing campaign, but the specific era of NES nostalgia that Rob caters to has definitely started to fade since the end of the Wii U era, so without a lasting series to attach himself to, he seems increasingly more like a neat novelty than anything else. I nearly cut Mr. Game & Watch for the same reason, but he at least represents a different console than Rob, if you can call it that, and he's been on the roster since Melee, so he's safe for now. Zero Suit Samus and Sheik are both remnants of an old mechanic and are literally the same people as some other characters on the roster. Okay, I know technically the Zelda on Ultimate's roster isn't Ocarina of Time Zelda, but they're both still Zelda. They're a shame to cut because playstyle-wise they're both pretty distinct characters, but in terms of being representatives of the series they're from, they can't help but feel like clutter. Lucario and Toon Link were introduced in Brawl to replace characters cut from Melee, Mewtwo and Young Link respectively, and now they're being cut too. It sucks that those playstyles aren't represented at all on this roster anymore, but they're pretty irrelevant characters at this point and we need to make cuts wherever we can. This next one stings for me personally, but I think the Mii Fighters have to go. Yes, by cutting the Mii Fighters, they do lose the lucrative option of charging for DLC costumes, but even though games like Miitopia and Tomodachi Life Living the Dream were made for Switch, it's clear that Nintendo is trying to de-emphasize the Miis. And besides that, being customizable makes them so different from the other fighters that it would probably be easier on the development side of things to cut them. These last couple cuts may prove a tad controversial, but of the remaining characters, I think they make the most sense. Ike and Robin are unfortunate losses because among the Fire Emblem characters on the roster, they're actually pretty unique, but their games are old and Chrom is still on the roster to represent Awakening in Robin's case. Awakening certainly deserves a character, but 3 is a lot. Nintendo made a big deal about having Mega Man in Smash 4, but like with Little Mac and Palutena, he's much less relevant now than he was then. And even though Nintendo has a good relationship with Capcom, Capcom does not have a particularly good relationship with Mega Man. I really wanted to keep Joker, especially since he's from a big JRPG franchise and we cut all those Square Enix characters, but his series isn't as relevant to Nintendo as some of the remaining third-party characters. And even though Nintendo and Sega have a good relationship, he is ultimately another third-party character Nintendo has to license. Maybe not the strongest reasoning, but at this point none of the cuts are going to feel great. This final cut is going to seem really counterintuitive at first, but bear with me. After 2 decades of inconsistent releases, it's clear that Nintendo is giving Donkey Kong a genuine push here at the start of the Switch 2 era. In fact, to spoil the newcomers on this roster just a little bit, we're going to be adding another Donkey Kong character in just a bit. That being said, we need to cut one more character to hit our 40 cut characters mark, and Diddy Kong is a holdover from the Rare era that largely seems to be over. Don't get me wrong, I love Diddy Kong. He's a dorky little guy and I messed around with him for a little bit back when Smash 4 was still relevant, but when looking for characters to cut, he just doesn't seem like as much of a heavy hitter as the characters we're keeping. As such, he will not be included on this roster. Oh, and I forgot to write this in the script, but Bowser Jr. is cut too. He's cool and all, he's just not as important to the Mario cast as the other Mario characters on the roster. Interrupting once again during editing to say that while I was busy forgetting Bowser Jr., I also forgot about Falco, who we're cutting because he plays way too similarly to Fox. Yeah, it sucks that Star Fox is down to 1 character now, but he hasn't had a new game in a decade and hasn't had a good game in even longer than that, so oh well. There, 40 characters cut, which means now we can get on to the new guys. You may have noticed that we cut a lot of first-party characters instead of the perhaps more obvious third-party picks, but that's because the lineup of newcomers are mostly first-party. Let's get some locks out of the way. A new Pokemon and a new Fire Emblem character are basically a given. I'm either going to say Tinkaton or Meowscarada for the Pokemon, and either Alear or Kai for the Fire Emblem character. They're the most recognizable characters from the most recent games in their respective series, so a fairly safe bet all things considered. I'd also be surprised if Noah from Xenoblade Chronicles 3 didn't show up. Sakurai loves Xenoblade, and unlike with Rex, there has been plenty of time since Xenoblade Chronicles 3's launch to include the main protagonist in the new game. I see these 3 characters as basically guaranteed, but there are a few more safe picks on the Nintendo front to talk about. Pauline and the Ring Fit Adventurer are 2 characters I hadn't considered until I saw them discussed in a roster predictions video by a talking sock, but thinking about it, they make perfect sense. Pauline has been pushed as a main Mario cast member since Odyssey reintroduced her, and she would make for a perfect tie into Donkey Kong Bonanza. The Ring Fit Adventurer would replace the Wii Fit Trainer as a joke character and representative of Nintendo's casual games. I thought Bandana Waddle Dee was out after not having been included in Ultimate, but with Sakurai including him in Kirby Air Riders, it's clear that he's not on some blacklist just because Sakurai wasn't the one to create him. I recognize that I'm doing that thing where fans connect Sakurai's non-Smash projects to Smash when it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but Bandana Waddle Dee is also highly requested, so I think those 2 points combined make a compelling case for his inclusion. Similarly, the Chorus Kids were beginning to seem unlikely after being cut from Smash 4, but with Rhythm Heaven Groove coming up, now would be the perfect time to add the most conspicuously missing Nintendo series to Smash Bros. Slightly less likely because I think Sakurai is tired of hearing from his fans at this point, but also highly requested is Waluigi. Everybody wants him, and including him and Pauline would mean the entire main Mario cast is present in Smash, besides maybe Toad, but, well, you know. Remember when we cut all those NES-era characters earlier? Well, Sakurai still loves his retro reps, and I think Ayumi Tachibana from Famicom Detective Club, who was considered for Melee but rejected due to irrelevancy, would be a good candidate now that the series has received a new game on Switch in the form of Emio the Smiling Man. If you'll recall, Robin and Lucina were both added from Awakening to Smash 4, and I think it could be quite funny if Nintendo did the same thing with Xenoblade Chronicles 3's dual protagonists, adding not just Noah, but also Mio. Some people might say that 2 new Xenoblade characters in one game is too many, but having both of them would help to better represent what Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is all about. Alternatively, maybe they share a roster slot like Pyra and Mythra and fuse into their Ouroboros form for their final Smash. My bias as a Xenoblade fan might be creeping in here, but I would say it's at least possible. The final first-party pick on this roster is the one I'm least confident about, but it sure is weird that Wario is marked as his own series but only has one character, right? I'm not even a WarioWare fan, but Ashley's inclusion seems really overdue. I also considered adding new Zelda and Metroid characters for similar reasons, but decided not to when I couldn't find any characters as iconic as the ones already in Smash. That's all for our new first-party characters, but to round out this roster, we have 5 new third-party characters to talk about. First off are 2 characters that would break the internet, but I actually think are very likely: Master Chief and Sans. Xbox as a console brand is dying, and Microsoft wants to spread their seed wherever they can. To that end, I believe they desperately want to be a part of Smash Bros. It's why we didn't cut Steve and Banjo earlier, despite seeming like licensing improbabilities before their reveals. I think Microsoft would make Nintendo a very reasonable offer in order to get Master Chief into Smash Bros. As for Sans, Smash has yet to see a true indie rep, and Toby Fox has a great working relationship with both Nintendo and Sakurai specifically. Sans' Mii costume was just a start. As Deltarune continues to skyrocket in popularity, Sans' inclusion in the next game seems more and more to me as an inevitability. Next, to make up for cutting all the Square Enix characters earlier, we're adding Geno to the game. Considering how much of Ultimate's roster was pure fan wish fulfillment, Geno seemed like a glaring exclusion. With Super Mario RPG having just received a remake, now seems like the perfect time to right that wrong. Shadow is another easy call. Sonic hasn't gotten a new character since Brawl, and Shadow just had a massive advertising push in the form of the Year of Shadow, and as part of that starred in the most acclaimed Sonic game in years. Yes, Eggman and Tails would have more unique movesets, but they're just not as relevant at the moment, and if anything, Shadow's similarity to Sonic would make him easier to implement. Finally, to round out this roster, I'm allowing myself one cheat character in saying that Phoenix Wright is getting in. In my defense, I wouldn't include him here if he also wasn't a highly requested character. Ace Attorney is more popular than ever right now, and Phoenix Wright already has a fighting game moveset thanks to Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So despite being a wishlist pick, he is well within the realm of possibility, even if I would rank him as the least likely of the newcomers on this list. So there you have it, my best guess at what Sakurai is planning for the next Smash Bros. Once again, this is not what I want to see, but rather what I think is most likely. What I want to see is coming right up next. Contrary to popular opinion, my ideal roster does still include a couple of cuts, mostly for the purposes of decluttering, but it's nowhere near half the roster, and we're going to go over the additions first. Though I think a lot of these characters are unlikely, I'm going to avoid what I feel would be actively impossible for the sake of thematic consistency. To that end, I'm also going to stick to a fairly standard amount of newcomers, 15 to be precise. I'm going to start with the characters I would be pretty excited to see, and work my way up to the characters that would absolutely blow my mind. The first 2 characters I'm adding are from series that I don't think are in desperate need of new fighters, but I would still be excited to see for these specific additions. Hydreigon from Pokemon and KK Slider from Animal Crossing. In regards to Hydreigon, the roster is sort of oversaturated with Pokemon, so if they're going to keep adding them, they might as well add my favorite. Besides that, we don't have a Pokemon from Gen 5 in the game, so Hydreigon would help to fill out the roster in that regard. As for KK Slider, he's easily the coolest Animal Crossing character, and I just like the image of him running around the stage and smashing his guitar into opponents Pete Townshend style. Moving on, I'm a big Harvest Moon fan, and with Stardew Valley being as popular as it is, it seems appropriate for Smash to pay the farming sim genre its dues. Instead of going with a specific villager, we're going to stick with the generic farmer. Let's go with the one from Harvest Moon 64 as the main skin. Smash has proven it's not averse to including avatar characters, and the farmer's various tools would be perfect for his moveset. I'm picturing something of a Byleth-esque character, minus the anime magic. The Prince from Katamari and Maxwell from Scribblenauts are both third-party characters with the potential for real screwball movesets. The Princess Katamari would allow for techniques unlike any other character in the game, and Maxwell could rely heavily on RNG through his item spawns like Hero with his magic. Also, the Katamari soundtrack slaps and I want it in Smash. When Byleth was announced for Ultimate, I was disappointed, not because they were another Fire Emblem character, but because I love Three Houses and Byleth is by far the least interesting Three Houses character. I would much rather have had Edelgard as the game's de facto main character, and I intend to right that wrong here. Byleth is the first cut on my roster, as Edelgard will outright replace them. Professor Layton is the first character that I would truly pop off for. Though not the most requested character, he's popular among Nintendo fans, and New World of Steam will hopefully be the shot in the arm the series needs to return to the limelight. His moveset would probably be a combination of slapdash references to puzzles from the series and his sword-fighting abilities. Along with Eggman, Porky was one of the glaring omissions from Ultimate's Heroes vs. Villains theme. It would have been the perfect time to get one more mother character on the roster now that the series is over. As such, I no longer see Porky as particularly likely, but I would still love to have him. Bowser Jr. is the only other character in the game that pilots a vehicle, and Porky's is much bigger, so it would still make for an interesting mechanical contrast. Plus, more Mother music would always be nice. Trails is still probably too niche to be genuinely in the running for a Smash character, but tonally a Trails character would fit right in with the other JRPG characters on the roster, and the Trails series has been my gaming obsession for the last 2 years, so I had to include Estelle on this list. She's not my absolute favorite Trails character, but she's up there and would do a good job representing the series as a whole. Her staff probably wouldn't function altogether too differently from a sword, but I'm sure there are enough distinctions that it can at least do a couple of unique things. Guilty Gear is one of the most popular fighting games on the market right now, and having Soul Bad Guy on the roster would fit right in with the other fighting game characters in Smash, while still having Guilty Gear's unique brand of insanity. But then, like the Prince, this is mostly just so we can have smell of the game in Smash Bros. Sans, Mio, Phoenix Wright, and the Chorus Kids are all characters I covered on my predictions list, and all characters I actually feel are reasonably likely. I'm not going to repeat myself too much, but I do want to add that I think Mio would be mechanically way more interesting than Noah. We have a lot of sword fighters already, but the only other character with anything close to Mio's twin rings right now is maybe Min Min. And finally, my most wanted Smash newcomer from one of my favorite games of all time, Neku from The World Ends With You. Like with Porky, I honestly thought Neku had a decent shot at Ultimate's DLC, since Neo released during Ultimate's DLC cycle, but Square hates Neo, so it was not to be. Nonetheless, Neku is still my most wanted. Honestly, he doesn't even have super crazy moveset options like some of the other characters on this list, who would probably just have a bunch of different magic attacks. This is mostly just about having The World Ends With You in the game, bringing the series to more eyes and giving us more remixes of Twister. Now to wrap this segment up, we'll be talking about the handful of cuts I'm making. Along with Byleth, I'm cutting all the Marth clones on the roster because we do not need 4 Marths in the game, so Lucina, Chrom, and Roy are all out. Also Corrin because Fate's Lamau. Dr. Mario, Toon Link, Young Link, Sheik, Dark Samus, and Zero Suit Samus are all cut because, like I talked about in the actual predictions roster, they're the same person as someone else on the roster, and that's just a pet peeve of mine. Okay, I know that Dark Samus technically isn't the same as Samus, but, like, they're both named Samus and they have the same build, so, like, for the purposes of the roster. Anyway, Piranha Plant, Pichu, Wii Fit Trainer, and Duck Hunter all joke characters as we've already established. Rob, Ice Climbers, and Mr. Game & Watch are the remaining retro reps that feel more and more irrelevant as time goes on, even if they all have some historical significance. Snake is tonally out of place, and I don't care how much Sakurai likes King of Fighters, Terry is by far the most obscure character on the roster. Finally, Ken, Richter, and Dark Pit are all really boring clone characters. Daisy gets to stay because Core Mario Cast. Also, Erdrick becomes Hero's main skin so we can have an actual named character representing Dragon Quest, and Pokemon Trainer is reverted to just being Charizard like in Smash 4, as he's the only popular member of that trio. Those are all the cuts, here's the final roster. As we start to move into the more out there rosters, we should consider the possibility that the next Smash game is going to be a total reboot. I don't think they'll actually do this, as going totally bare bones removes a lot of the excitement factor associated with Smash nowadays, but I do think in a lot of ways it would be appropriate. We're going to do a couple of reboot rosters, the first of which will be an Original 12 reboot. Who the Original 12 of today would be is not a question I came up with, but is one I do think would be appropriate to discuss in this video. Mario is a lock, obviously, but unlike in the first Smash Bros. Where we also got Yoshi and Donkey Kong, Mario is also standing in for all Mario adjacent series, so that there's more room to include other franchises. To that end, we are also limiting each series to 1 character, even though Mario and Pokemon had 2 characters in the first game. Sorry, Luigi. Link, Pikachu, Kirby, Samus, Olimar, and Shulk are all characters that I don't think require much discussion. They're all the main characters of mainstay Nintendo franchises. Even though Villager was the first Animal Crossing character to be added to Smash Bros., I think Isabelle has far outpaced him as the mascot of the series, so we're going with her instead. Similarly, Byleth, the main character of Fire Emblem's best-selling game, is a lot more relevant right now than Marth, whose game was barely even localized. So Byleth is taking Marth's place as the Fire Emblem representative. Finally, even though we only have 12 characters, I do think this roster has room for third-party fighters. Sonic isn't the biggest third-party fighter in Smash at this point, but he is the most relevant to Nintendo, so he's in. Steve gets to stay in because he is the biggest third-party character in Smash. He comes from the best-selling game of all time, and like I said earlier, Microsoft really wants to be in Smash. A much shorter discussion than the last 2 segments, but that's what happens when your roster is only 12 characters. Moving on to another tiny reboot roster, we have the roster that sparked this video in the first place. My original idea for a Smash reboot, a Smash game with no returning fighters. This was the first roster in the video that I would consider an impossibility, but if Nintendo weren't cowards, this is what they would do to shake things up after Ultimate. Honestly, a lot of this roster will be a retread of what we've discussed in the other rosters because again, it was the first roster I made for this video. Like with the last roster, I'm limiting myself to 12 characters here. Right off the bat, Waluigi is here as our Mario rep due to his aforementioned status as the most requested fighter. Skull Kid is pretty well requested as a Zelda rep, but I think I'm going to give it to Tingle instead due to his recurring status. Impo's recurring too, but she's just less interesting to me. She'd be pretty similar to how Sheik is now, I think. I'm going with Tinkaton for my predictions roster for the Pokemon rep, and KK Slider for my wishlist roster as the Animal Crossing rep. Aleer, Bandana, Waddle Dee, and Noah can come from the predictions roster too. Also Sans, Shadow, and Master Chief for third parties. Octoling might seem like the obvious choice for an Inkling replacement, but I'm going to go with Callie and Marie instead because I think they'd be more interesting both as personalities and as fighters. Maybe they can have a Pyra and Mythra or Ice Climbers thing going on. Metroid should have a rep, and I'm vaguely aware of the names Silux and Ravenbeak, but I'm not a Metroid fan, and instead of doing research to see who's the most fitting actual rep, I'm just going to add an actual Metroid as this game's joke character. Also, when I made this roster, I forgot to include a Pikmin character, but I don't think there's another Pikmin character that stands out quite as much as Olimar does, so kind of a weird group of characters, but it was going to be from the outset, and I think we do have a couple of genuine crowd pleasers in here by mixing the previous rosters. Again, I kept this segment short because I know this roster is a little repetitive, but fear not, because the next roster will be nothing of the sort. For the roster featuring no returning franchises, I was originally just going to start reading the PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale character list as a bit and then move on. But I saw this comment under a Talking Sock video, and that inspired me to give this roster a genuine chance. Now, I could just start listing off all the B-tier Nintendo franchises that aren't in Smash yet, but I don't think that it would be very interesting to watch. Instead, it might be helpful to introduce a theme. For a challenge this restrictive, I think the most freeing thing to do would be to approach it from a retro perspective. A list of once famous Nintendo characters now lost to time. The game could be called Super Smash Bros. Throwback Throwdown or something like that. A spin-off with an altogether different mission statement. So yes, that unfortunately means no Rhythm Heaven, even though that's the first thing my mind would jump to for a roster with no returning franchises on it. Just bear with me and we'll see how this goes. Since this is another Reboot roster, we'll once again be sticking with 12 fighters. Because we're talking about retro properties that haven't been included in Smash Bros. Yet, there are going to be a lot of sports-based characters. The biker from Excite Bike is an obvious choice, and maybe he can have a Mach Rider alt costume as a reference to the Grinch leak. Although we're sticking with mostly NES-era games, retro doesn't necessarily mean just NES. The pilot from Pilot Wings and Snowboarder from 1080 Snowboarding both represent once popular sports franchises that have since fallen by the wayside. As a single modern character, we can even have the Sportsmate from Nintendo Switch Sports to represent all the black box sports games. I know I implied that we'd be avoiding characters I've talked about already, but Ayumi Tachibana fits in too well here not to include. Further on the topic of previously considered retro characters that were ultimately cut, we can include Takamaru from the mysterious Murasame Castle 2, since he was considered for Smash 4. Mike Jones is a character that I remember a couple of YouTubers talking about around the time of the Smash ballot, and being a forgotten NES character, he'd work here. The titular Balloon Fighter and Urban Champion from their respective games are well known enough to make the cut too. EVR Race was Nintendo's first ever video game, and even though it's completely lost now, there's some footage of it online, and it would be cool to include as a callback to Nintendo's roots. Based on the footage, it looks like some kind of horse racing game, so we can just call the character Equestrian or something like that. Don't think there's no room for third parties on this roster even though it's all retro. We can still have the alien from Galaga as a stand-in for Pac-Man, and, as possibly the most iconic game of the era, let's throw in a Tetronimo from Tetris as the final character. Though most of these characters are no longer relevant, it's impressive how recognizable the majority of them still are and how the roster is still largely balanced in terms of playstyle. There are a lot of different gameplay options on here, and I'd definitely be willing to try out a game like this. We still have one roster left though, a roster even more absurd and impossible than the one with no Mario characters on it. Could it be a roster that has Goku and Shrek on it? A roster of all Fire Emblem characters? The PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale bit for real this time? Well, do you remember when we were doing my ideal roster and I said I was constraining myself to the general Smash Bros. Tone and structure? I didn't have to do that. If I was totally selfish, I could just make a roster out of my favorite characters from my favorite games, and that's exactly what I did. That's right, this entire video was just built up to a favorite games list. My top 50, to be exact. Because I have to go through 50 characters that are mostly newcomers, I'm going to keep this brief. 2 sentences for each character. One recommending the game and one for the character themselves. I'm not going for mascot appeal anymore. We're entering deep cut territory. Hold on to your hats, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a couple new games to try out along the way. We've been talking a lot about Undertale today, but between you and me, I think Deltarune is better. It has more developed characters, combat, graphics, basically everything. And of the Deltarune cast, Chris is my favorite. A fascinating subversion of the silent protagonist trope. I won't spoil anything about Chris, but Deltarune is worth playing just to see what Toby does with them. Animal Crossing New Horizons isn't my favorite Animal Crossing game, but the vast array of customization options still makes for a deeply enjoyable experience. For my character pick, we'll have our first of only a couple veteran fighters, Isabelle. The original Scribblenauts is the only game in the series that got the level structure right, each level being a unique and self-contained puzzle that tests your creativity and ability to think outside of the box. Maxwell's the obvious character choice. I mean, who else would I go with? One of his cousins? I'm not a big platformer fan, but I can't help but admire just how tightly Super Mario World is designed. There aren't a ton of characters, so really the choice is obvious: Luigi. Ditto for Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. I'm not a huge fan of Yoshi as a character, to be honest, but there aren't a lot of other options, so let's just slap Baby Mario on his back for variety's sake. Guilty Gear Strive is the game that sold me on 2D fighters, and it oozes a style unlike anything else in the medium. I picked Soul Bad Guy for my realistic wishlist earlier, but my main in the game is Ino, so I'm gonna have to go with her. Guitars as weapons are just too cool. Similarly, Splatoon 2 is the only competitive shooter I've ever really gotten into. Splatoon doesn't have a ton of characters to choose from, so I'm picking Pearl as the underdog of Off the Hook. Katamari Damacy Reroll is one of the most unique games I've ever played mechanically. It truly feels like a work of art. Once again, the Prince is kind of the obvious character pick here, though I imagine many would go with the King of all Cosmos instead. Miitopia is a Tomodachi-like RPG, which are two of my favorite things rolled into one, so of course I love it. I could pick one of the pre-existing Mii Fighters, but Mii Popstar would be so much funnier. Fire Emblem Three Houses has an impressively likable cast of characters for how large of a group it is. It's hard to pick a favorite out of all of them, but Hilda is pretty funny and she uses an axe, which would provide some variety to the roster. Pokemon Emerald has a completely different vibe than most of their Pokemon games, probably because the GBA is the only console just to have one gen, and provides more of a challenge than the rest of them too. Shedinja is my second favorite Pokemon behind Hydreigon for its gimmick, which is impractical, but so satisfying to use when the opponent has nothing that it can hit it with. Pokemon Platinum expands Gen 4's story to the point that it becomes actually engaging, and once again provides a decent challenge for a Pokemon game. Weavile oozes coolness and even appears in another fighting game Pokken Tournament. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has one of the strongest main parties in a JRPG and one of the most gut-punching single scenes I've ever seen in a video game. Even though Mio is a great character and would have an interesting moveset, I think N is probably my favorite character from the game. A truly tragic villain who the DLC elevates to become morally gray and complex to the point that he's on the same level as Xenoblade's other great antagonists, perhaps even above them. Anyone who says Tetris is a flawless video game is correct, and the competitive edge Tetris 99 adds makes it all the more addicting. As for the character, I gotta go with my boy, the Line Block. Professor Layton in the Miracle Mask adds a lot of intrigue to Layton's story through the flashback segments. Emmy's more aggressive attitude adds a fun new dynamic to the Layton-Luke duo from the original trilogy. Professor Layton in the Unwound Future is widely considered the best entry in the series for a reason, having a compelling narrative that sucks you in until you finish it. Of course, I couldn't have the Layton series on a Smash roster without including the British gentleman himself. He's just so charismatic. Rhythm Heaven may be the weakest entry in the series, but that's not saying much because these rhythm game collections are all 9s and 10s out of 10. DJ School and Mock Step come close, but I think my favorite minigame is the Rocking Frog Hop, earning the bandleader a spot on my perfect roster. Rhythm Heaven Fever is a similarly consistent outing with catchy music and a weirdness all its own. My favorite minigame from this one is actually the Japan-exclusive endless game Manzai Birds, the titular birds being a duo that could perhaps have Ice Climbers-esque interactions. Puzzles and Dragon Z is an extremely underrated puzzle RPG that you probably only know from being bundled with that one Mario game. I'm not going to pretend any of the characters are super deep, but the over-the-top twist villain Enigma is pretty goofy, I guess, and he's certainly more memorable than any of the monsters themselves, so we'll include him. Despite being Japan-exclusive, Rhythm Tengoku is pretty accessible for non-speakers, and includes the most minigames missing from Megamix, so it's worth playing for that alone. My favorite minigame from Tengoku, and in the whole series in fact, is Ratmen, and so we have another duo character in the form of the Ratmen. Chris Tales is a gorgeous indie RPG that was widely panned just because it had poor load times, which in my opinion should really not dissuade you from playing this gem. Out of the party, Zaz is the spunkiest and most consistently entertaining, so we'll be adding her to this roster. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice has the most compelling mystery element in the entire series.
People hate on Athena's case,
But she has a strong dynamic with Simon and is generally the most underrated character of the main cast. She'd better be the main character of the next game. Harvest Moon Skytree Village was my gateway drug to farming sims, and even though it's considered one of the bastard Harvest Moon games, I appreciate its earnest attempt at having a story. Elise was the bachelorette I went with on my original playthrough, so she's the fighter who will be joining the battle. I'm not a big Zelda guy, but Majora's Mask is the exception, with utterly compelling side quests and a crushing atmosphere.
Here during editing again. Originally during this segment I said that they should add Skull Kid as a representative from Majora's Mask, but I completely forgot that Tingle is also from Majora's Mask, and I like him way more than Skull Kid, so we're adding him instead.
Unfortunately, despite the blatant plagiarism, Fear and Hunger 2 Termina outranks Majora's Mask by just a tiny bit because Miro is one of the greatest designers to ever do it. Termina has a lot of great characters, and normally I don't go for the asshole types, but Osa has the insane aura to back up his assholery, even if he can't use guns. The Legend of Heroes Trails from Zero is the best Trails game because despite dealing with relatively low stakes for the series, it does the political and world-building elements so well. Randy is such a lovable goofball, in spite of his character flaws, and in the sequel, you get to see a deeper, more complex side of him. The Denpamen 3 The Rise of Digital is one of the greatest deals in gaming despite all the grinding, because for just $10 you get a full JRPG made by the Pokemon Coliseum team. Squelch is a Porky-esque recurring antagonist whose descent over the course of the game is compelling to follow. It helps that he's more distinct than most of the generic Denpamen. Balatro would probably be a perfect video game if it had any amount of narrative styling, but I haven't stopped playing it since I first got it, so I guess I can't critique it too much. Space Joker probably isn't the best Joker in the game, but as the saying goes, 99% of gamblers quit before they hit it big, and 99% of Jokers quit before they get into Smash Bros. Pokemon Ranger Shadows of Almia is the best game in a spin-off series whose goofy gimmick works in spite of itself. Rhythmia is a fun character that works with you throughout the game, and I think it's good to get a couple human characters from the Pokemon franchise on the roster, so on she goes. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Justice for All is commonly cited as the worst game in the original trilogy, but I vastly prefer it to the first game, as it has two of the best cases in the entire series. This game is also the one to introduce Pearl Fey, Maya's cousin who's always a little confused but has the spirit, and ultimately aids in the setup of the sequel's final case, the pinnacle of the series. Omori is just sad, man. Aubrey really exemplifies that. She took the events of the game especially hard, and seeing her work through and begin to bounce back from them makes for an extremely compelling character arc. Persona 5 Royal is impressive mostly for being entertaining for 120 hours straight. Kasumi, one of the characters new to Royal, is one of the most well-developed characters in the game and has a strong dynamic with Joker. The Beatles Rock Band is a rhythm game about the Beatles. Since the game has no original characters, we're going to have to break the video game characters only rule and just add Paul McCartney, the best Beatle, to the game. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe is a hilarious meditation on choice, and specifically choice in video games. The narrator doesn't have a body, but he is the best character in the game, so I'm sure they can figure something out with him. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity is unduly hated on, having a cat and claws just as strong as previous Mystery Dungeon games, even if it's a bit narrower in scope gameplay-wise. The best character in the game is Quagsire, because they'll randomly bring up his mysterious and action-packed backstory at random points for comedic effect. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky is the traditionally acclaimed Mystery Dungeon game, and yeah, I can't really argue with that. A strong story and a boatload of post-game content make for a devastating combo. The twists and turns the game takes you through with Grovile's character makes him the obvious favorite of the cast, and that's with some tough competition. Neo The World Ends With You perfectly blends fan service with a plot and cast that stand tall all on their own. Shoka is the most well-developed character of the cast and has a strong dynamic with her fellow party members. I did an entire video on how well-written she is, in fact, link in the description. Pokemon Black and White have the best decks and the best story in the series. As we've established, Hydreigon is the star of the new Pokemon, with a killer type and design. Xenoblade Chronicles is maybe the most mind-blowing twist in any piece of media I've ever seen that will make you want to replay the entire game again just to look out for the foreshadowing. Alvis is the most compelling character of the cast, carefully teetering the line between hero and villain, and always having an air of intrigue about him. Tomodachi Life is endlessly replayable, the content being as limitless as the character combinations you can come up with. Unlike with Miitopia, there aren't distinct classes, so by default we'll have to bring back the Mii Brawler. Rune Factory 4 has some of the tightest gameplay of any game I've ever played. The entire cast is engaging, especially for a farming sim, but my favorite is probably the puppet master Dolce, who is a straight man in a duo with her ghostly companion. Hypnospace Outlaw takes the internet and uses it as a playground for mixed media world building. The star of Hypnospace's user base is the Chowder Man, a washed-up rock star whose attempted career revival is cut short when he loses his leg in a helicopter crash. Truly the king of tragicomedy. Rhythm Heaven Megamix lives up to its Japanese name, the Best Plus. There aren't a lot of new minigames in Megamix, so instead of a minigame character, the roster spot goes to the main character of the story mode, Tibby. The story may be kind of flimsy, but it's still in the spirit of the series and effectively facilitates the gameplay. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Trials and Tribulations is home to one of the greatest finales in gaming, effectively wrapping up not just itself, but the entire Ace Attorney trilogy. Dick Gumshoe is of course the best character in the series, a lovable oaf who nonetheless always gets the job done when he needs to. Fear and Hunger is one of those games where every element feels intentionally and intelligently placed in order to emphasize a certain idea, in this case fear. Lagarde is the character cutting off his arm on the title screen and comes back in the sequel with a killer boss theme. Animal Crossing New Leaf is the game I've put the single most hours into. Here's where I finally get to insert KK Slider once again, meaning there are now 2 guitarists on the roster. The World Ends With You perfectly marries its narrative with its gameplay in a way unlike any other game I've ever played. Neku's character trajectory may be obvious, but the way he goes back and forth and wrestles with his own emotions makes for one of my favorite character arcs in any video game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was the first game I ever played that felt truly cinematic, and I will never stop loving it for that. Thankfully, the best characters in the game are already in Smash, so we can just leave them in there. Pokemon Black and White 2 are commendable for just how content-dense they are. Since we've already got my favorite Pokemon from the generation on the roster, I instead want to give the spot to my favorite human character in the series, the self-motivated and quippy Colress. And finally, my favorite game of all time, the timeless, eclectic, and hilarious Earthbound. Porky is the only character in the game who actually develops, so he's by default the best one. And there you have it. 6 increasingly absurd hypothetical Smash rosters. Some of them exciting, some of them unappealing, and all of them probably wrong no matter how much I tried to get into Sakurai's head. I probably could have milked this for a couple videos, but I figured it'd be better just to get it all out of my system now. I hope you enjoyed it. Stick around for whatever random gaming or music topic I decide to cover next.